Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island of the City University of New York. Today we continue our 5-part series on contemporary Italian cinema. We'll be seeing the first film of 2 in this series, directed by Marco Bellocchio. Today's film is China is Near. It's an analysis of the politics, sexual and social, of a small Italian city during an election period. It's also a wild, fast-paced comedy. We'll be talking about a number of aspects of the film immediately following today's screening, and as usual, we have 2 guests. They are Professor Leonard Quart of the College of Staten Island of the City University of New York and Professor Peter Brunette of George Mason University. Enjoy Marco Bellocchio's China is Near. I can do a second. Hi, welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed Marco Bellocchio's extremely fast-paced China is Near. We're going to slow down here just a bit for the next 30 minutes and discuss, I think, a number of interesting aspects of the film. I have today, as always, 2 guests with me, and I'd like to take this moment to introduce them to you. Sitting to my left, and not for the first time on the show, I might add, is my colleague from the College of Staten Island of the City University of New York, Leonard Quart. Lenny is co-coordinator of the Cinema Studies program at the college. He's recently completed a book about the Vietnam War and how it was represented on film. The book is called How the War Was Remembered, and we'll all be looking for its publication. Lenny also occupies his time, in addition to his historical and critical interest, with some film journalism. He's widely published in that field and is in fact an associate editor of the distinguished film magazine Cineaste. Sitting to my right is Professor Peter Brunette. Peter teaches literature and film at George Mason University in the Washington, D.C. area. This will be Peter's first appearance on Cinema Then, Cinema Now, but not his last, because he'll be appearing next week when we show another Bellocchio film, In the Name of the Father. Peter has also recently completed a book that is in print now. It's a major critical study of Roberto Rossellini, published by the Oxford University Press, and the New York Times was wise enough to give it a favorable review. Peter also has interest in film journalism and is published in the New York Times Book Review, Washington Post, The New Republic, Sight and Sound, and a set of other matters. Since we've got you here after that introduction, Peter, I thought we might start with a sort of, who's Marco Bellocchio? Bellocchio is a marked contrast in certain ways in reputation to Bernardo Bertolucci, because our audience had an opportunity, I hope they took it, to see in the preceding 2 weeks 2 films by Bertolucci, who is extremely well known in this country, particularly for Last Tango in Paris, slightly lesser degree for 1900, but who's one of those big names in America in Italian cinema. Bellocchio is not a big name here, a profusely gifted man, I think. My question is pretty simple, Peter. Who is this guy, anyway?
Sure, excellent question. I think it all comes down to one thing, Jerry, and that's Marco Bellocchio has never made a film with Marlon Brando.
Okay.
the way people get to be known, filmmakers get to be known in this country is by making international productions with internationally known stars. Occasionally you'll have a film like Tampopo or
the Italian noodle western.
The Italian noodle western, exactly. But these kind of no-name films that appear from absolutely from nowhere. But what people probably don't know, and those of us who attend a lot of festivals know, is that the chance of a film like Tampopo or the Makioka Sisters or something like that actually capturing a wide audience that these films sometimes do is probably about 1 in 10,000.
Right.
There are just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of wonderful films every year that are made, but because they're made in Norway or Hungary or Zaire, they simply never show up. Bellocchio and many other Italian directors who are equally unknown here has been making wonderful films for about 20 years, but they're very, very, as you saw, having just seen this film, they're very, very political films, and which is always a no-no in the American market, of course, first of all. And second of all, they're thought by many to be very, very specific to the Italian context, and that they can't really be understood by Americans. Now, obviously, I think that's silly. Let me give you a little bit of background on him. He is a middle-class kid who has been, on occasion, a Marxist, sometimes a very schematic, a very kind of ideologically driven Marxist. Other times he takes a kind of a comic overview of this kind of thing. He wandered into the Italian consciousness with an incredibly powerful film called, in Italian it's called I pugni in tasca, which is Fists in the Pocket, made in 1966, I think it came out. This film, I showed it to my students last year, and even 20 years later, it is incredibly raw. And I think Bellocchio was something like 25 or 24 when this film came out. So suddenly he was the enfant terrible, and became very well known in Italy again. But that film is so particular to the Italian context that it didn't have much, reputation. It never gathered much reputation internationally. The film that we just saw, La Cina è vicina, it's called in Italian, which is a nice pun there. China is near. La Cina è vicina, was made the year after Fists in the Pocket. And the way I've always seen this film is a kind of a comic version, if you will, of the same themes that we find in China, in Fists in the Pocket. According to me, now not everyone agrees with this, but I believe, and I'm not saying this critically or negatively, but I believe that Bellocchio has basically been making the same film over and over and over. He is obsessed by sex, politics, money, the church, what else? And
family, of course.
The family, and
Don't
psychoanalysis, and all of that, right? And the whole psychoanalytic questions. And basically what he does, he's drawing the connections among these things over and over and over again in completely different ways, but the core is always the same.
Yeah, so he fits into this category of obsessive artist. Yeah.
And those are the ones we're finally most interested in. At least I'm the most interested in. You know, people that are making films not just to make a lot of money or to make themselves famous, but are making them because they have to.
Well, I mean, let me just take 3 quick but very large examples. Among 3 of the most respected 20th century novelists, classical modernist authors, everybody would say that William Faulkner, D.H. Lawrence, and James Joyce all kept writing the same novel over and over again, obsessed with roots, obsessed with location, obsessed with certain kinds of concerns. Yeah. Well, this film has a particular political resonance to it, and I'd sort of like to turn slowly but surely to our associate editor of a journal of politics and film, Cineaste. What about this political angle in Bellocchio?
Well, I would say the key to the movie is a critique of the family, an attack on the family, but politics clearly play a profound role in the film because the family, which is an upper bourgeois or even upper class family, it's not clear, they'd have the Contessa, Helena, but the family manifests bourgeois attitudes, but Vittorio, the probably the main figure in the film, is become a candidate for the Socialist Party,
Right.
which is part, at that period of time, of a four-party coalition with the Christian Democrats running Italy. Bellocchio obviously has utter contempt for the Socialist Party, and at this point in his life, for the politics of compromise, the politics of parliamentarism, the politics of gradualism. And in the movie demonstrates how a Socialist Party, which is, from his perspective, somewhat ossified, really a comic
Right.
force, a force without any ideology, seems to have chosen this candidate because he offers a kind of upper-class cachet to the Socialist Party. But the candidate, and Vittorio, has no ideology at all, has bounced from party to party, including being vaguely sympathetic to the ultra-left.
Absolutely.
And being a fellow traveler of the CP as well, or the PCI in the Italian terms. And, yeah.
Explicate PCI in Italian terms. Just tell me about that.
Okay, the Communist Party in Italy was and is a much more sophisticated party than the Communist Party, let's say in the Soviet Union or in any of the satellites, or in France, or in America.
Right.
It was a sophisticated party. By 67, 68, I don't think it had made a commitment to historic compromise yet, but had been committed to parliamentary politics, had dropped the class struggle essentially from its polemical line, had been committed to, by then, beginnings of alliances, at least within local and regional elections, and had committed itself to a politics which, from an ultra-left, or from Bellocchio's perspective, was open to contempt, was meaningless, was essentially no different than the bourgeois politics of the Christian Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Let me add something to what Lenny's saying, though, to set up here our own little political dialectic.
Okay.
I think what is also important to see, I agree totally with what Lenny just said about Bellocchio's critique of the ruling parties. And by the way, for those people in the audience who aren't aware at all of Italian politics, they should understand that a socialist in Italy is not necessarily a Karl Marx figure. I mean, a socialist in Italy is like a Democrat. I mean, really, a sort of maybe Teddy Kennedy would almost be the equivalent of a socialist in Italy. So it's not, some revolutionary crazy.
It's not off to an extreme of the political
Absolutely
perspective
not.
at all.
And even the communists in Italy are a very tame group, and there are many jokes that go around in Italy about the communists with their huge villas and their boats and their big Mercedes and all that.
So-called Mercedes Marxists.
Exactly, Mercedes Marxists. They seem to have a lot of those in Italy. So he is making the critique of those parties, there's no question. But at the same time, what I find so great about the film is that he is making terrific fun of the Maoists.
Oh, absolutely.
And this Camillo, to me, the whole film kind of is summarized in the notion that here's a kid who's in a Catholic school. He's a Maoist. He's in a Catholic school, and he thinks his sister is a virgin.
Yes, I thought she was a virgin.
And this, at first you think he must be joking. No, but that's the point he's making. And that beautiful opening sequence there, it's early on in the film, it's not in the opening, when he's reading that political tract and everybody else is falling asleep and they're throwing the ball to the dog just to harass him. I mean, that's, for anybody who has sat through a boring political meeting, which was correct politically, but say quite removed from the real world,
Right,
they'll appreciate that scene.
But I think that Bellocchio, who is at this point somewhat sympathetic to that left, still has the capacity to undermine it, to understand that at least this Maoist, who is not a member of any large organization, this is a provincial town, it's not Rome or Turin, it's a town, I think, of 50,000, 55,000, that this Marxist, or this Maoist, is terribly infantile, is obviously very frightened and very anxious sexually, and the film goes through all sorts of elaborate devices for him to both, I assume, to lose his virginity, and at the same time utterly committed to the church, because he does not seem to be facetious or satiric about his own commitments to the priests or to the school that he is a student at. This Maoist politics are seen as infantile and almost privatistic. They're seen more as a family rebellion than a rebellion against the state or against the structure of society. So the tactics that they use are absurd tactics, but also tactics that do come out of the 60s. They have a 60s quality.
Lenny, there's the moment in which he is introduced visually, I mean, it's a mark of the style of this film, how much Bellocchio gets out of that moment, because we'll remember he's looking at himself, but we can't quite tell it's a mirror. He's looking into what is a poster, a cliche of Marxist solidarity of the masses coming out of an aesthetic of a socialist realism, and he's comparing himself with one of those heroes of the public. That's what he's comparing. But then, when his friends arrive, we hear them arrive, and he turns and we see he's been looking in a mirror. So what we see, we thought he was looking at a picture, and what he's actually been doing is examining himself, and it's the perfect visual exposition of the essential narcissism of what he's...
yeah, I would say that politics are essentially masturbatory. They are the politics, and this is in retrospect, but a lot of the politics of the late 60s and then of the ultra-left were. And I think it's a marked quality of the Bellocchio film, because Bellocchio belonged to an ultra-left group in 68, 69 for a couple of years, that he was able, at least in 67, he may not have been a member, to send this up. So at the same time, clearly his critique of the conventional parties and the system comes out of an ultra-left position. But he also seems to understand that the ultra-left doesn't have an answer either.
Yeah. And I think what's important to see, and I'm sure you'll agree with me completely on this, Lenny, is that what we don't understand in America, I think what we tend to do in America is think that politics are something extra. In other words, that you can be the way you are, and you can be a professor, or you can be whatever, and then there's completely accidentally whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. Because, you know, basically from my perspective, I see them as pretty much the same thing. Certainly from an Italian perspective, a Republican and a Democrat are virtually indistinguishable. But in Italy, everything is politicized. So many, in a state government agency, for example, there have to be so many communists on the board, so many socialists on the board, so many Republicans, so many liberals, because there are 13 major parties in Italy. So it's something, Lenny's exactly right to put this in the context of the family, because this is the quintessential scene of Italian cinema. You know, if you want to be really reductive about it, in other words, you could say
Be it for a moment.
Sure. All Italian cinema is about the family. Fellini does it one way. You know, I mean, where would Fellini be without the family, right? Without these crazy scenes around the dinner table, which is the site of all this familial anguish somehow. He does it more in a comic vein. Bellocchio, I think, is trying to make the connection between the sort of patriarchal structure of the family and the political patriarchal structure and the religious structure, and that for him all of this has a psychological or a psychoanalytic reality, because it's all tied up with sexual drive. In other words, are these people, you know, are they just trying to satisfy their sexual urges, or are they really being political, or everything's all mixed together?
One of the marvels, I think, of this film, and I think of the film we'll be seeing next week, In the Name of the Father, is that he continues to explore those relations without renewing them. Just when you think you might have come to the conclusion that they're ruled by libido and nothing else, then there's something that seems like a genuine political commitment momentarily. But so then that is compromised by a connection with the church. Then that is compromised. So everything, nothing is stable, because each of these factors influences or compromises the other, which will never allow from a stable position, and will never allow you to be positioned, as you said, of America, where politics is just something extra. It's added on in some way.
There's another dimension we should mention, that the working class characters, or it's hard to really define them as working class. I suppose they're seen as working class by the family, the bookkeeper and the secretary.
Lower middle class.
Lower, petty bourgeois in our terms.
Marginal white collar.
It's odd, clearly have more energy than the upper bourgeois, than the power elite, who seems to have decayed and desiccated and become desiccated and ineffectual and comic. And even Elena, who for a moment seems competent, the next moment seems hysterical, fragile, and close to collapse. But the working class, in its avidity is essentially a quest for absorption, for entry. And that fantastic scene where he is looking at the glass, and she and her possessions, and one sees her in reflection, Elena in reflection, feverishly, almost panting, visibly, but not not in terms of sound, but visibly panting for him, is just, I mean, it just sums up metaphorically his desires, both for her as a sexual object and her possessions as an extension of her. And at the same time, the working class characters, none of the characters are corrupt or evil. They're not defined in absolute terms, in terms of agitprop cliches. Right. At the same time, I wouldn't say they're subtle psychologically either, but they're just people who have the usual selfish drives for mobility, for success. And Carlo, the working class man, is clearly more intelligent than any of the other characters in the film. Yes.
Yeah, well, there's also that marvelous moment in which Carlo, after Carlo and Giovanna have strayed into the arms of the upper class, in which he says, well, it's not that I'm unattracted to her. But he says, well, but she does have money, so I'm more attracted to her. But I think I'm explaining myself poorly. It's not that I just want her money. I'm attracted to her as well, and it's a scene of a charming forthrightness about how he can't sort out these motives. He said, of course it would be different if she was poor, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't like her.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Bellocchio is saying here is that ideological purity is a luxury of the upper class. Yeah. In other words, you'll remember that the serving girl or the secretary, her status is kind of ambiguous. She upbraids her boyfriend at first for working with the professore to take him as a candidate, because what kind of a socialist can he be? And he sort of says, "Gee, yeah, you're right," but in fact goes ahead and does it. So you can be saying on one hand, you could think that Bellocchio is attacking this lower stratum of society, saying that, well, look, all they're really interested in is material possessions, and they have absolutely no interest in a more sort of class solidarity. Right. But in fact, they don't have any options. This is the only option that's open to them, whereas the upper class people are already operating out of a very luxurious position. So they can afford to be, Camillo, for example, can afford to be a Maoist.
Well, this also, this is something that becomes very clear in the use of setting, because the first scene is Carlo and Giovanna, who have to be in the councilman's office putting benches together to make love. That versus Elena's luxurious bedroom suite. It's given in terms that anyone would understand. Where do you want to spend your erotic encounters? On wooden benches or in a lovely bedroom?
But there's nothing, because by 68, 69, when he joins this ultra-left group, this Maoist group, ultimately he leaves because he says he could not understand. Bellocchio leaves because he could not understand their desire to construct this mythic abstraction of the people. Right. That for him as a filmmaker, as an artist, he could not deal with these abstractions about the people because it had so little to do with reality. So he was not one to buy any phantasms about the people. He was there, he's an artist who understands the particularity of reality, the texture of human lives, and how still, whatever one ideological constructs you can devise, they often falter when meshed or when they collide with the real world.
And he got into a political polemic with the actor Lou Castel, who is the principal actor in Fist in the Pocket, and appears later, we'll see next week, in The Name of the Father. Lou Castel was more leftist than Bellocchio, and he felt that Italian cinema, period, was just a bourgeois, it was sort of a functionary of the bourgeois system, and really didn't want to, or had wanted to have as little to do with it as possible. Bellocchio's position, I think, was always much more realistic, in that, if we were in a truly revolutionary situation, sure, then let's go for it. But given the fact that our situation is definitely pre-revolutionary, this is one way, the Italian cinema is still one way of changing and molding consciousness.
And he was always interested, clearly, and in recent years even more so, and clearly the notion of some kind of psychological transformation or redemption through love, through human connection, through relationships. Though even here, he has a notion of normal madness. In Leap in the Void, a later film, he defines madness often as leading a claustrophobic family life, that the bourgeois family or the family itself constructs patterns of pathology, which are the day-to-day madness, which can't be just defined as pathology, but are just our daily routine of madness. So, I mean, here's a man who did not see answers as purely political, institutional in nature. He always saw them within some kind of psychological and personal level as well.
Let me just pick up on a word you've been using, and that is seeing, because I think to see this film is quite an experience. Now, with the rise of some more sophisticated, I think, commercial American television in the last 5 or 10 years, audiences, I think, a certain audience may be used to rapid movement among the development and exposition of a number of plot lines, keeping all of these things straight. This film is 20 years old, and I still think it remains an extremely fast-paced film in an extremely fragmentary way. And I bring this up now because it's very much connected with this notion of what character is, because he defines character in terms of actions, particular actions first, and then moves outward towards class generalizations. But that's very different from political filmmaking that defines people. This person is working class, therefore this person has a set of things, then works toward the individual from there.
But the interesting thing here is that the film is built around character and is not particularly interested in mise-en-scène at all, that it does not work with the texture. He said somewhere in an interview he was not interested in setting and world. As different, let's say, as breaking from neoreal, from Bicycle Thief or Paysan or Rossellini, that he was not interested in the texture of a social world. His emphasis was on family dynamics and family relationships done through this parallel cutting and very abrupt cutting.
Absolutely.
And where you see this especially is he's tremendously influenced by Godard.
Yes.
In an interview, he said he appreciated what Godard was doing, but he really was not influenced by him very much at all. And I think this is just completely crazy. It's the son denying the father, in a sense. So he was very influenced by the new wave, and especially a film like Breathless. Came out in 1959 with this incredible cutting. You see this really very clearly in Fist in the Pocket, this kind of very jarring jump cuts that are very disturbing and keep you on the edge.
Well, less so here, because this is a cooler, more carefully choreographed film than Fist in the Pocket.
Yeah, and well, it's a kind of a movement that I think he does, Lenny, and what's taking place here is that, for example, in the film we'll see next week, In the Name of the Father, this was made in '72, so it was made 5 years later. And in between, he had some experience directing plays in Milan. And so the space, the theatrical space, becomes much more important in The Name of the Father than it is here. I agree with you totally. There's a sense of flatness, there's a sense of the reality is made cinematically rather than sort of spatially and then just photographed. And you see that over and over. But one thing I don't want us to forget about this film is how funny it is.
Yes.
This is a hilarious film. And unfortunately, so much of it is lost in the subtitles, as always, because there's so many jokes about the Italian scene and that, this whole scene with the bomb, for example, in the Socialist Party headquarters is just, a stitch from beginning to end.
Complete with the fact that they know it will be the brother, but the brother for wrong reasons on the end of the telephone, and at the same time the brother is trying to bomb people. He's being eaten out by the priest for you're making a long distance telephone call,
right.
and so there's this intersection of these this collision of levels of seriousness, which is consistent throughout the entire film, because that's the way in which the editing style in the film matches the comic style, because the comedy in this film is generated by these wild contrasts between what a character's self-exposition of intention is, and then how they act, and the editing is constantly cutting back and forth among these characters to show the levels of comic hypocrisy involved in this.
And this is why I know that this is absolute critical heresy in America, but this is why I finally prefer a director like Bellocchio to a Sacred Cow director like Fellini, because they're both using the same character, the buffoon.
Yes, yes.
But Fellini plays him for a buffoon, and he begins as a buffoon and he ends as a buffoon. I think Bellocchio, the character, the professor, is a totally ridiculous person, but serious points are made through his ridiculousness.
Yes.
And there's even a touch, though the film doesn't play for poignance, there is even a touch of poignance connected with him. That last speech, though it's absurd with the dogs chasing the cat, and there is a kind of poignance in his attempt to define some place for himself in a political world, some place in life that he doesn't quite have. I wanted to just throw in something about Sammy and Rosie, a film that I'm interested in, because also...
This is a very recent film. Stephen Frears
and Hanif Kureishi have done a film parodying English politics and English concerns, contemporary English concerns, not quite in the vein of Bellocchio, much more hysterical, much more intense, but also built around fragmented cutting, a great deal of cross-cutting and parallel cutting to subplots, and also shot from the left, sending up the left, probably sending up the left with more uproariously and with greater severity than Bellocchio does, and sending it up possibly at this moment in a way that one wouldn't expect from English cinema, given the history of English cinema.
Okay, no, but it does suggest, whatever differences there may be, that there is this tradition if we choose to look for it, because it's not something that's necessarily easy to find. And Bellocchio films are not easy to find in the United States. I'm not sure that Sammy and Rosie, let's hope it gets, or it has had, by the time people see this, a large release. Nonetheless, people do get these films made. They're of significant interest politically and aesthetically, and if you look around for it, you can find it. Now, I want to turn to Peter and say, are there other Italian filmmakers whom you think are comparable to Bellocchio, or is he kind of this lone ranger of a kind?
Well, that's hard to say. You know, lots of different Italian directors have parts of Bellocchio in them. The Tavianis, for example, have their political interests because both of them have been members of the Communist Party and have a political take on things as well. Other directors indulge themselves in the same kind of wild frenzy that Bellocchio seems to like, that sense of the grotesque that you see in this film and the film we'll see next week.
Alonzo Fon, the Taviani's Alonzo Fon comes closer to Bellocchio, though there's a much more operatic quality to the Tavianis, but it's shot from the left, sending up the left, with a sense of profound pain about the incapacity to achieve the utopian moment, a utopian moment that they believe is a political impossibility and it's based on a self-destructive politics.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up the Taviani brothers because we're going to have to close on them, but I'd like for everybody to know that the final film in this series will be a lesser-known film by the Taviani brothers called The Meadow, and I think Bertolucci, Bellocchio, and Taviani, the Taviani brothers that is, while they all have very distinct cinematic concerns, narrative concerns, their own set of stylistics, the one thread we see is that they will not let go of a politics of their country. They must confront it in their cinema. If you'd like to perhaps not confront this series, but know more about it, Cinema Then, Cinema Now, or you'd like to know more about cinema studies, graduate or undergraduate, at the College of Staten Island, drop us a note. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give you that information again, okay? Write to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Well, Lenny, it's a pleasure always having you here. We bump into one another quite frequently. Yeah. And Peter, thanks for coming up from the D.C. area. We look forward to having you back next week and hearing more about Marco Bellocchio from you. I hope that you've enjoyed our discussion here, and I hope it leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us. One of the amazing things